Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the surprise new album from Thom Yorke, titled Tomorrow's Modern Boxes. You know, it's been a really long time since I've talked about Radiohead in any capacity. The critical darling band of so many music critics. Starting off in alternative rock in the early 90s, they quickly dove into the offbeat land of very chilly electronica that on later albums would proceed to influence thousands of artists and albums for the next several years. And I'll admit, they're one of many bands that I can definitely respect for what they've done without really liking them or calling myself any sort of fan. And most of my frustrations with Radiohead can circle back to Thom Yorke. It's been a slow process, but for the most part, I've gotten over most of my issues with his vocal delivery, even though I'll say that he'd never be one of my favorite singers. But you know what? I've always found him to be a more interesting singer in alternative rock, just fit his more organic sound better instead of electronica, which has meant that many of his experiments in that direction have left me feeling a little cold on him, either with Radiohead, his side project Atmosphere Peace, which dropped their debut album Amok last year, or on his solo projects. See, the odd thing with Thom Yorke is that he's a very expressive vocalist, and many of his lyrics tend to fall into the exact same category. But when paired with such stiff, regimented electronics, the contrast can come across as a little bit jarring for me, and not in a good way. And yeah, I get why Thom Yorke does it. As a singer and performer, he's always seemed distinctly uncomfortable in the presence of other human beings, and that angst does inform a lot of his material, but I gotta be honest, it's never really clicked all that well with me. Now that being said, I was definitely curious to check out his surprise album, Tomorrow's Modern Boxes, released via BitTorrent a couple days ago. And after all, despite my general antipathy towards Thom Yorke, he's one of the more influential artists in the electronic sides of rock these days, and that's what's popular right now. So I downloaded the album and gave it several very intent listens. What'd I find? Well, it's an interesting listen, I'll definitely give it that, but being interesting is a pretty big step away from being close to good, and I'm not convinced at all that Tomorrow's Modern Boxes by Thom Yorke is a good album. It definitely has some solid moments that I kinda liked, but it's one of those weird albums where several individual pieces don't work at all on their own, but as a whole it can sort of come together into something remotely cohesive. The big surprise for me is that all the pieces that don't work are exactly the opposite of what I was expecting would work, and vice versa, which made the listening experience a little bit odd, at least for me. So let's start with what I thought would be my biggest consistent issue with this album, and that's Thom Yorke's voice. Now, I've gone on record saying that I'm not really the biggest fan of him, but his despondence here really does fit the lyrical tone of this album. Not so much bitter, but tiredly resigned to the fate that's awaiting him. It helps matters that many of the songs let him stay in his lower range, which I tend to like a fair bit more than his upper range or his falsetto. And when he does go higher, it's restrained and it's very quiet, with just enough subtle production to prevent it from going flat or bleeding off key, which can definitely happen when you sing as quietly as he does here. It's just a lot of vocal control, and I respect that. It actually reminds me a little bit of Steven Wilson's vocal production on songs like The Motherlode, and for me, that's only a good thing. I like that. Now, that's definitely more than I can say from some of the vocal snippets and some of the production that are dropped across several of these songs, like when the pitch shifting renders the incredibly squeaky or just plain annoying, like on the opening track of Brain the Bottle or all of There Is No Ice for My Glass, which then piles on the reverb, which doesn't help, or you go to the chopped in reverse samples on the last half of Truth Ray, or all across Pink section, the latter being the second instrumental piece on this album, and easily one of the most grating songs I've heard thus far this year. So okay, what about lyrics and themes, the other element that I'm not always the biggest fan of with Radiohead? Well, honestly, they work pretty well too. Thom Yorke's lyrics tend to be very starkly sketched, with odd, still frame imagery, but this album somehow manages to make it work, surrounding overall themes of being very trapped and isolated. And this is where Thom Yorke's despondence really works to sell the material. He's already accepted it on some levels, probably familiar to him, and he's just weathering the tide as he and everyone else gets sorted and dropped into Tomorrow's Modern Boxes, defined less by physical barriers and more by emotional distance, sometimes driven by electronics, be it the rejection of A Brain in the Bottle, the pessimism against the darkness of new opportunities opportunities on Guess Again, losing the freedom to lie and mask one's feelings on a song like Truth Ray, where everything must be exposed, or the social stigma on Interference. And the album closer, Nose Grows Some, shows the aftermath, describing a one-night stand where the girl's lack of emotional honesty pens her in, even as Thom Yorke has fully embraced the fact that he'll be moving on and will come back, and that emotional honesty frees him from his box. Now, the most fully formed and best song in this album by a mile is Motherload, and it serves as the emotional high point as the clown that nobody laughs at and everybody chooses to ignore makes a break for freedom, because even if he really does feel empty inside, he's still going to display courage and he's going to make a break for that freedom because, god damn it, he wants to get free of that box before he gets locked in. And while Thom Yorke seems to regard that clown with bemusement and the track doesn't really land a very potent emotional high, I gotta admit, the song still works and the more upbeat tempo really helps. But the biggest problem with this album is the instrumentation, and I gotta admit it doesn't work, especially if you start examining deeper and separating out the pieces. And the cruelly ironic thing is that for all of Thom Yorke's sonic innovations and experimentation, this album has some of the very same damn problems as so many modern indie electronica and synth pop records do this year, in that the percussion tends to be decent, but the melodies are severely de-emphasized or given keyboard tones that are either flat or completely unimpressive. The frustrating thing is that Thom Yorke is still a solid producer, working with Nigel Godrich and producing a real mix with dynamics and depth. And some of the percussion lines are really do good, like the scratchy line on Guess Again, but the synth tones, they feel small, leaden, and while they might fit the overarching themes and overall atmosphere of the album, doesn't exactly make it pleasant or all that memorable except for the absolute wrong reasons. Now take the opening track. It starts with this binaural oscillation of blubbery synths before switching into a slightly higher tone of blubbery synths, before switching into a tone that sounds like somebody's running a power drill underwater or squeezing a dog's squeaky toy. The synth melody on Interference, it's a little bit better with the high electric piano and reverb enhanced swell, but the backing synth only feels like slightly fuzzy musical wallpaper and only seems to add dead weight to the song where it's not needed. Truth Ray has a melodic progression that could have sounded rich, but except it's now chopped up and filtered through a wall of fuzz and reverb, which I almost wished was on the case for Nose Grows Some, which had a decent popping beat and cymbal line, but the synth line feels so inert and flat. It does nothing for me here. Now, I will say that I did like the interplay between the percussion and the bass melodies and the skittering high key line and There Is No Ice in My Glass, or with the piano on Motherload, but really, it's the pianos that Thom Yorke uses throughout the album that are one of the biggest problems with the instrumentation, whether it's going completely offbeat on Guess Again or just picking terribly flat and badly tuned pianos on the two instrumental pieces. The latter, Pink Section, featuring effects that sound like bees that are buzzing right by your ear that sound absolutely awful against that low keyboard section, which could have given this album some desperately needed gravitas, which it just does not have. And no, I know that some of you are now thinking, well, all those pianos are contributing that human element to such a rigidly mechanical album. Artistic flourishes that reveal the man behind the machine. Okay, they might add some organic presence, but the transitions are handled very poorly. This isn't like Swan's To Be Kind, where you could see every breakdown and it fit magnificently together with the rest of the tracks, but here, in contrast with the admittedly well-executed instrumental shifts on the rest of this album, it looks instead like Thom Yorke just got sloppy on the keyboards and left it in because, really, this is a vanity side project the whole time until the next Radiohead album finally comes out. And really, that's ultimately where I'm going to fall on this album. I'll admit that this brand of electronica is not normally my thing, and those of you who are more familiar with it probably will like it. But in revisiting Aphex Twin's discography in preparation for covering Cyro, I found a real melodic focus and degree of texture to his material that I have to say that Tomorrow's Modern Boxes just doesn't have. Just like its title, it feels very rigid and constructed, with individual elements that only serve to annoy and frustrate me, even despite vocals and themes that were way better articulated than I ever could have expected. Just a damn shame the instrumentation just did not click with me whatsoever, which means I'm only giving this album a decent 5 out of 10 and only a recommendation if you're a hardcore fan of Thom Yorke. It's a thinly sketched, occasionally interesting, frequently irritating album. I just hope Thom Yorke got it all out of his system before the next Radiohead album, which hopefully will be a lot stronger. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Fans of Thom Yorke, fanboys, just take it easy on there. Keep in mind, Thom Yorke has never really been my thing. Just keep that in mind. If there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation or any other albums coming out you want me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.